I guess what we'll talk about today is why the U.S. is such an outlier in pediatric gender medicine and what some of the ramifications of that are. And Lisa, why don't you start by sort of bringing us up to date on what's been happening in Europe and what's happening here and how those two things don't connect so much.
Sure. I'll start with what I think I know. Um, what I think I know is that France, Finland, Sweden, and the UK have all acknowledged that that there's a new cohort of young people seeking gender affirming care or adolescent sex changes, whatever we want to call it, that had hardly ever been seen before, which are teen girls with other psychiatric issues. And they've acknowledged that detransition, which was thought to be low to non-existent, people often say 1%, that it's higher than that, that nobody knows how high it is, but they've acknowledged that it's higher than that. And they've acknowledged that there are known and unknown risks of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to fertility and brain development and bone health and other things. And what's happened in the US, as far as I can tell, and anybody can jump in and add to that, is that each of those facts has been politicized in the US. So those are presented as right-wing arguments to oppress trans people rather than evidence that the affirmative model, which affirms a gender identity and medicates it at the wishes of the consumer, healthcare consumer,
And that's in childhood, right?
in childhood and adolescence. So all of these things that have happened in other countries were cause for concern, often among the clinicians themselves who were feeling like, I don't want this responsibility. If transition is more common than we thought, if we don't have research on this cohort, it's too much responsibility for me. I need someone to tell me, I need someone to evaluate the evidence and tell me what to do. But here, what's happened is those are presented, it became left versus right. So anyone talking about rapid onset gender dysphoria or detransition or risks of these medical interventions is suddenly a bigot.
And that doesn't happen in Europe. That's not the way that it's seen there.
No, I think it happens to a certain extent. I think there's activism on both sides. I think there are people who want no child to medicalize, and I think there are people who like the American kind of consumer affirmative model of healthcare. I just think they have. I think they have healthcare systems that are based on, they decide what to pay for based on evidence reviews because the government is paying for it. So there's no financial incentive. I think it's harder for it to be fully infiltrated by a kind of activist mentality. It doesn't mean it hasn't been, because as Joe pointed out a couple of weeks ago when we were all texting about this, the Tavistock, which obviously made a big announcement today in the UK, that it's shutting down and moving to this regional model of care. They have the same socialized medicine, and they were veering toward the affirmative model of care. And I do remember, I haven't looked at it since it came out, but in the CAS interim report, I remember them singling this out as a kind of American model of care. To be suspicious of, and that it doesn't work in these countries where they don't have this, go up to the counter and order what you want if you can pay for it model of care. That's
Leor,
what I think is happening.
okay. And Leor, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first of all, Lisa, your article is just excellent. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciated it. And I know that it's already starting to get some pushback from people who say, no, the law doesn't say this, that, and the other. But I think you're right, especially when you read it in conjunction with other laws that California has passed. I think your assessment is correct, and I appreciate that you wrote it.
Let's just wait before, let me interrupt for 1 second. Lisa, what's the title of your article so people who are listening to this can go find it?
You're talking about the SB 107 article?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called The Dangerous Overreach of California's SB 107, I think. And it's about a bill that I think will pass and be
Yeah.
replicated in other blue states
Yeah.
that can be interpreted to say that any child can be brought to California and medicated with, I think you still need a letter for surgery, um, but it basically allows people to violate custody agreements and usurp parental rights in all kinds of ways if it's because a child is seeking gender affirmative medical interventions.
Right, and I think Lisa, you're spot on when you say that this is a reaction to Republican states passing bills to try to curb or eliminate pediatric transition, and to a number, I think, of examples of overreach on the Republican side, including Texas's investigation of parents. I think that's an overreach, even though there is some medical justification for it. I mean, I think it's too much. But here's kind of where I don't disagree with you on your analysis. I just think that there's some deeper issues that we need to think about. One is, yes, this has become swept up in the kind of the logic of culture war and partisan warfare. But why are American parties the main drivers of the debate over and regulation of pediatric gender medicine? I think that's a very important question in a way that parties in parliamentary systems are not. And it seems to me that this is actually a very good example of the weakness of the American state, the weakness of the American welfare state, and the weakness of American political parties as institutions. Because one of the hallmarks of kind of our post-1960s political parties is that we've neutered them institutionally. We've made it very difficult, if not impossible, for incumbents to rely on the party apparatus when seeking re-election, both in terms of funding, in terms of campaigning, in terms of institutional support. And what that means de facto is that incumbents are left much more vulnerable to pressures from interest groups, from where they get not just funds, which is very important in order to win election today, but also a kind of a source of moral support, to say nothing of campaigning. If you are a progressive Democrat running in California, you cannot afford to anger the Human Rights Campaign. You just can't. You're going to lose your election if you do. So I mean, it seems to me that even though you've put your finger on, I think, on why uniquely among political parties, the Democrats have in the West, the Democrats seem to be just going full, just insanity on this issue. I think the deeper cause has to do with our political system itself, not so much with the ideology. Because look, I mean, you have progressive left-leaning, ideologues in the Green Party in the UK and in other places. I mean, that's not unique to us. You have trans advocacy groups like Stonewall and other organizations in other countries. That's not unique to us. And even though, yes, we don't have a centralized healthcare system that can impose regulations from top to bottom, and a public funded health service that that puts more limitations on what is and what isn't doled out, that still doesn't explain why one out of our two major political parties has carved it into stone that they're going to die on this hill. So
Wait. I would sort of say that both have, but on different sides.
yeah, I mean, that's true. And that's, of course, the logic of partisanship.
But Corinne is shaking her head. She doesn't think that both sides are willing to die on this hill.
Yeah, there's captured Republicans, is what I mean to say.
What do you mean there's captured Republicans?
Well, for example, in my state of Indiana, there was a bill that passed both the House and Senate by large majorities that would have maintained the women's sports for natal girls and women. And the governor of the state, a Republican, in a pretty red state here in Indiana, buckled and he vetoed the bill. And he could have just let it pass. He didn't even have to sign it. He could have just let it pass into law. But he vetoed it. And he's not the first Republican governor to do that either. So I wouldn't say it's the parties are lined up against each other. It's to me, it's a lot more ideological.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, the only, I mean, that's true. I think the Utah governor, what's his name? Hutchin, I can't remember. Also vetoed the bill, the sports bill. You know, one thing that Republican governors have cited when vetoing these bills is that the courts have basically struck down these laws, or at least put a temporary injunction on them, for reasons that are really bizarre. I can get into that if you guys want, but for reasons that are bizarre. But that's what courts have done. And what it means is that, you know, you have a legislator passing a law, and then the AG office gets embroiled in this legal battle, which is a huge distraction for its limited resources, not to mention very expensive and embarrassing. And they end up losing. So, you know, the Utah governor vetoed the bill saying, look, we're going to lose in court. What's the point? So I think you're right, Karina, that there are certainly Republican incumbents that face very strong internal pressures to, if not toe the line, then at least not plant their flag in the hill. But at the same time, there are also some pragmatic considerations for why Republicans are not uniformly trying to push back against this stuff.
Well, I don't have any way of backing this up with facts, so maybe I should be very reserved about what I say, Lior. But my guess is that more than one of these Republican politicians has a friend or is in a network of friends where those families are transitioning their children, and that I think that this goes beyond the party lines and goes very deeply into the personal. And I think that a lot of these individuals in power, regardless of what their party is, that they don't have the internal understanding or fortitude to speak out against the transitioning of children. That is my guess. That's my intuition about it. So I don't expect the parties to line up cleanly on this because, you know, as those of us who've been referred to as TERFs and transphobes know, you really don't want to be on that side of the line. And after some time, you know, hey, I'm not transphobic. I don't hate anybody. There are actually really deep and important issues that we need to sort out here, that you finally get up the gumption to actually take a stand on it. But I think that a lot of people are going to go through a phase where they allow themselves to be cowed, and they think that it's a lot better to let a few children be transitioned and not say anything about it and defend that sort of activity than they are to actually take a stand on it.
Buck, you've been nodding for quite a bit. I'm going to let you come in.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Eric. So I always go to the money. I just have been, because I cannot wrap my head around why we would be doing what we're doing when it's so obviously wrong. I mean, you can, if you want to do science, go ahead, do data, do research. They've shown that. That's why all the countries are stopping, you know, moving forward with adolescent gender affirming, whatever you want to call it. So for me, everything you are all saying is so true, but I just cannot wrap my head around why, even as you're saying, the parties who usually are so separate on these kinds of ideas are, what you're saying is that there's like a nuance on some level there, and that's also scares me. So then I have to always go, what is the underlying factor of all of this in this country, in the United States? And, you know, from what I watch from afar and what I listen to everyone and on all sides and looking and listening to parents of trans kids and all of those things, it just comes down to false facts. They're not factual. They're lying to people about what's going on. They are clearly lying to parents, and money has to be somehow pushing this agenda, because I call it an agenda. There is no way in heck that people would any other situation where you put kids in this situation, I think people would be appalled. So how it's so easily to sway, because I see people swayed in it, and I'm like, how could they easily be so? And then I just keep going back to funding financially. When I see stock market get involved in it, when I see people say invest in trans, adolescent surgery, which is the most scariest thing I've ever heard in my life. Like I as an elder in the community and somebody whose life was saved by this situation, I have to be concerned with sort of lies and
What do you
untruths.
invest in trans surgery? What do you mean by that?
It's shocking. Literally on stock market websites and other money spaces, they are saying put your money into surgeries, into medicine, because it will become a billion-dollar industry. It's written. I can throw you all the information. I'm sure you all know that. That's shocking to me.
So George is nodding. He's seen it. I'm sure Lisa has seen it, but I've not seen that. Joe, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Buck was saying, and I may be the outlier here on this issue, but it feels a lot to me like what I went through with COVID, that it feels like the sides are the same. There's a big financial gain on one side, and that everybody on the affirmative care side and the pro lockdowns, pro everything, it's always that kind of Jonathan Haidt, the care foundation of morality, where we're kinder, we're nicer, we're the caring ones, and on a population level, on a voter level, what you see is this kind of splitting, which makes rational thought impossible. That's why I think we've rendered ourselves incapable of thinking about what's going on.
Yeah, you're making me realize what a good example this issue is of what I've called the cultural illness. We have a cluster B cultural illness, where we have instilled the mental habits of borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. In that, we are splitting essentially. We're saying one side is all good and one side is all bad in general. People can tend to see it this way. It can be hard for people to see that when somebody says, I don't want my child to be socially transitioned, that they're doing that out of real care and concern. Or if somebody is saying, I don't want children to be socially transitioned, and they don't even have their own child, in that situation, people tend to say, what do you care about that? You clearly don't care about these. And it's hard for people to see that that's about care, that that's about compassion. And then, the sort of, self-referential, self-involved, and dramatic expression of gender identity in young people seems in some ways to be an expression of it's a way of expressing a kind of alienation and loneliness and meaninglessness that doesn't get addressed. And instead, we're encouraging that narcissistic and histrionic kind of expression. And then the lack of empathy for anybody who doesn't agree with us. So these are the cluster B traits that I think that we're kind of creating a culture of cluster B, issues. Anyway, so getting back to the question of pediatric gender medicine, Buck, do you know what the increase in double mastectomy, or do any of you know what the increase has been in double mastectomy in kids, like in people under 18 or under?
Whose article?
One of the reasons why this is such a difficult debate in the United States is precisely because we don't have good data. We just don't know. We don't have a centralized health authority that keeps tabs, although the GIDS clinic in the UK was not very good at keeping tabs either, but at least they had some numbers. But in the absence of real hard data, there's a lot more room for speculation, for conspiracy theories, for accusations of blind spots, and that's a real problem. We do know that there are a non-insignificant number of people who experience regret, maybe even detransition. We know that number has grown. We're pretty sure that number has grown. We know that double mastectomies on minors are happening. We don't know at what rate. We don't know what the safeguards are. We don't know what the vetting process is. I've spoken to quite a few clinicians, quite a few medical experts who have told me that they don't even know what their own colleagues are doing. The whole field is just completely deregulated. And that's not surprising because it's an experimental, totally new area of medical practice. So, it's not surprising that it's deregulated and that there's no good data.
And I've seen people say this is not experimental. How is it that, how is it that people say that it's not? What's their reasoning?
It's totally experimental. Well,
Totally right.
everything you see today in gender medicine is experimental. That none of this is, again, I'll go back to my 30 years of transition. Going today, things are still happening that happened to me 30 years ago. So this is still experimental. Everything they're doing now, they're not putting nipples on, and I know I make a huge deal of that because I have to. They're speaking as if it's normal to give a adolescent top surgery and then tell them they don't need their nipples. I mean, that's how insane that whole space is. You're right. There's no regulation. Zero.
Wait, explain that, Buck. What's happening to why are they? I don't know. Didn't know this was happening. And
It's
why?
shocking. It's shocking. No, it's actually happening. And I started to investigate and I started to ask the young people, why are you not putting your nipples on? That's not top surgery. That's body modification. And then they're telling me, oh, well, the surgeon told them, oh, you don't need nipples. They're actually useless. And, it'll just be better if we just don't put them on because it's hard to put nipples on. You have to take them off and then put them back on. You have to align them. They tend to get infections easier. So to me, that's a sloppy, lazy surgeon. And so now there's a whole group of youngsters who are just going around with no nipples and completely okay with it for now, right? For now, these are 16, 17, 20-year-old people who are okay with it now. But that's what they're being told, that they don't need that. We all know, sitting in this room, that nipples are important for many reasons. And to say that is a lie and dishonest to a patient. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on that a lot of people don't know out there. And I find it to be irresponsible and unethical from surgeons.
I
Oh,
don't.
and also, that's part of the when I was talking to some people in Finland and Sweden, they said the other thing that had happened was starting around 2015, instead of seeing people who wanted to modify their bodies to appear more like the opposite sex, they started to see this variety of gender identities and people wanting modifications for in between. And maybe here, under this system of healthcare, like maybe that's fine because it's the more consumer model, and you're just, you can go to the plastic surgeon and get modified to be whatever you want, right? Because it's all about making you into who you want to be. But for those clinicians to do that in service of eliminating gender dysphoria didn't make sense because there was no research on that. And so when you had kind of the advent of non-binary medicine, which I wrote about in my book, but very uncritically because I didn't want to get canceled, but that there started to be people, young women saying, I just want a little bit of testosterone. I want peach fuzz and a slightly lower voice. I'm not going to go on it forever. And I think those people especially, were trying to attain a kind of permanent tomboyhood, right? Like they were asking for a la carte interventions to achieve this ephemeral goal that the clinicians in these other countries didn't understand. I mean, I don't know why it's not. There obviously are a lot of clinicians concerned here and trying to blow the whistle, and the media ignores them. But it still makes me wonder, what's the difference? Why was the sudden desire for looking trans as opposed to looking like the opposite sex, when we don't have any research on that? Why didn't it bother more people here that we can't say, yes, this is the right thing to help you with your gender dysphoria? That question seems to have been abandoned here. It became about trans and not about gender dysphoria.
Because they say you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. So now kids don't even need to have a diagnosis to go, you used to have a diagnosis, and then it would go through a system. That system no longer exists. So anyone can actually do whatever they want to their body, even a youngster. So we don't have that structure of safety involved now. We have what they like to call body autonomy, and these kids own their own body and they're allowed to do whatever they want to do. So I think that's why that is, and surgeons don't care. There's surgeons doing 5 top surgeries a day.
Well, that's one of the issues, I think, is that not only is it unnecessary to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and as we know, a lot of the kids who, and especially girls who in their teenage years develop this identity as trans don't actually have gender dysphoria. But that's one issue, including the fact that activists don't want gender dysphoria to be labeled as they don't want it to exist anymore as a diagnostic category. But the other thing is that I remember reading something a while back about a clinic I think it was in California, where the woman who was being interviewed there was saying, well, now we're seeing a lot, and she was saying this very uncritically, now we're seeing people who want to come in and just get a touch of testosterone, and they want to just have a little bit of this. And she said, we're taking our cues from them, as if that was normal, right? Right. And so I think that part of this has to do with either a misunderstanding of the cognitive capacity of young people to have judgment, or a way of thinking that is sort of aligned with this this thing that you sometimes hear from well-meaning teachers who say, I learn more from my students than they learn from me. That sort of attitude that young people have all the wisdom, and that you outgrow that purity and that wisdom, and you become so, acculturated or assimilated or something, such that you are it's almost like the inner child phenomenon of, the 1980s, where the inner child was supposed to be the pure, authentic self, and you somehow got corrupted as you got older. I don't know.
That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau's long influence over us. This whole idea of childhood being a stage of purity, right? Because before Rousseau, the thinking was, you see this in Locke and other thinkers, the thinking was children are just immature adults. And the responsibility of parents and of society is to bring them up to be rational individuals, self-directed, responsible. Then Rousseau comes along and says, no, childhood is its own unique phase, and it's inherently valuable, and social institutions are corrupting. And so the real task of education is to kind of prolong this period of innocence as far as possible. And politically, that also means changing social institutions in order to accommodate this inner voice of nature. And that, through John Dewey and other progressive reformers, Herbert Crowley, that really totally reshapes from the ground up American public education throughout the 20th century. And we get what Lisa was talking about earlier. We get kind of the contemporary understanding of education. I think when teachers say things like, I learned just as much from that's all false modesty. No teacher actually believes that she's learning more from her students than she's teaching them. Give me a break. If you thought that that was true, you'd be out of the profession. What justification do you have to be in a classroom if you're the one doing the learning? Give me a break.
Yeah, well, but we see this too when we get to college, where, and Ben can speak to this, having, he's the one among us who most recently graduated from college. But in college, you now have this. When I was in college, at least my experience was that my contemporaries and I went to college knowing that we knew less than our professors. And now you get students arriving on campus who want to school their professors because clearly their professors are less morally perfect than they are and know less about all kinds of things than they do at age 18, 19. And I mean, this I find quite astonishing. Ben, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, listening, it's like we're talking about the financial motivation, in the U.S. having this, for-profit, uh, you know, healthcare and what, how that differentiates us from the UK and Finland and Sweden. But for me, it also just constantly goes back to academia and academics who push these, you know, and this is a debate that's gone on for decades now, in terms of this social constructionist view versus this essentialist view. Essentialism is a dirty word, but there are the social constructionist view has really won out in humanities and in sociology departments, and those really radical ideologues are essentially just they're not really educating students so much as they are just indoctrinating them now with a kind of critical social justice ideology where there are tenets to follow, and it open because of this kind of queer theoretical lens that's placed on everything. Everything's very warped, and there's no agreed upon truth, scientific fact. When things seem certain, they are seen as suspicious. So what that does is that just opens the door for the most radical and crazy ideas to be put forth. And there's really no limit. There's no cap. So that's why we've gone so quickly from seeing, I mean, it was just a couple years ago that I saw for the first time people tweeting about like non-consensual puberty. And I thought, well, that's just like such an insane concept, and then now
I
that's a
never heard that
common,
term. People are talking about non-consensual.
That crazy.
but that's really, whether or not you hear that term, like that is an idea through which all these new practices are being filtered through. That's just kind of an established concept
Yeah.
of
What
that.
what what that makes me, if you can say that puberty is something that needs to be consensual, then suicide in childhood is a choice, right? Because no child was asked to be, it wasn't consensual to be brought into the world. So, like, what what is the how it? I'm like not wrapping my mind around this, Joe.
Yeah, I want to keep trying to circle back to Leor's idea, and I think that this idea of deconstructionism, postmodernism, how much it took root in America. I have an ongoing debate with a French friend of mine about Foucault, and she says that all of those ideas are like regarded as kind of ridiculous over there, but somehow they really took root in American academia. And I think that is another contributing factor to why we can't get beyond this divide here.
Yeah, Leo.
And Joe, if you don't mind me chiming in for a second, I live in a working class neighborhood and I'm friendly with my neighbors, and they think that all of these sorts of ideas are really baloney, and they're just absolutely gobsmacked that there are elites in our society who have convinced themselves of some of these things that are just plainly in contrast to reality.
It takes advanced degrees to be able to believe things that make no sense. Lior.
I'm going to partly disagree, at least with the assumption kind of running under this criticism, which is that number one, that elites have really imbibed these academic theories. And number two, that there's a kind of a direct line, to put it bluntly, from Foucault through Judith Butler to gender surgeries for kids. On the first issue, I've spoken to a lot of people on this issue, as I'm sure all of you have. People on the left, I mean, including people who are very supportive of trans and especially trans kids' rights and things like that. I've yet to come across a single person who, when really pushed on this topic, when really open to kind of critical examination, really believes in the kind of the kookier side of queer theory. That the body is inherently socially constructed, that we have no access to truth, that it's all just linguistic games. Who believes that kind of stuff, right? And everybody
people in the gay community believe that. I know people in the gay community who totally buy it.
I would say most people I've talked to don't use that language, but they believe that they now believe that sex is constructed, right? They've bought the argument based on the misinterpretation of Anne Fasto Sterling's work, and that sex is a construction, that the sex binary is a colonialist white supremacist. These are regular trainings in public schools and teacher training. So they're not citing Foucault. They're just promoting these as facts, but we can trace them back to these other sources. But they've been, and certainly in the circles I travel in, just the ladies of my run club who are just as shocked, horrified by the things that come out of my mouth. But, they accept these ideas that really are queer theory ideas, whether they use that terminology or not.
And
just to finish the thought, though, at least in my experience, more often than not, I'd say the vast majority of times, when you really push and dig, the fallback is always a therapeutic argument. It's always some version of, we need to be kind, these people are suffering, we need to affirm them, blah, blah, blah. And if affirming means adopting some of these ideas, at least at face value, at least professing these ideas, then so be it. I think it was Lionel Trilling in his book on sincerity and authenticity said, in a very, I think, prescient remark towards the end of the book, he says, on exactly this topic of elites adopting what seems like a totally absurd understanding of reality, he says it's a hallmark of elites to assent to an idea without giving it actual credence. And I think that that's a very, very good way of putting it, right? That there's a kind of a superficial assent that doesn't really have much behind it. But the second thing I wanted to raise is just, if you actually look, and I'm sure a lot of you have, at queer theory, at Foucault, at Judith Butler, everything in those texts, everything seems to be in total opposition to pediatric gender medicine. Starting from Foucault's criticism of the idea that there is a true sex hiding beneath reality, starting with Foucault's idea that medical science has authority to speak scientifically on sex and sexuality, and then through Judith Butler openly calling gender identity a, quote, regulatory fiction, and then Judith Butler also claiming that medical interventions to make intersex people appear to be the opposite sex or one of the two sexes is, as she puts it, submitting to the norm of the knife. It's just on and on and on. You could not get a more critical engagement with contemporary pediatric gender medicine than queer theory. So it's a little bit striking to me that, people call this juggernaut gender ideology, and they lump together this kind of essentializing medical management discourse on the one hand with queer theory, which is profoundly hostile to it on the other hand.
I can reconcile that for you, Lior. The project of the queer theorists is to dismantle the cis hetero patriarchy, and the most effective way of doing that is by developing foot soldiers that really confuse in the minds of the public the boundaries between sex. And the most effective way of confusing the public about the boundaries of sex is to transition children. So there you go.
Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, you know, one, you know, with what Leo was saying about like elites not necessarily really believe that you speak to people like they really don't really believe this. But I think we have to go back to like, but the kids do. And the thing is that with kids being living inside their phones and really fashioning identities in the privacy of their bedrooms, they're not interacting. They're actually watching these YouTube videos of influencers and on TikTok and really fashioning identities and thinking all up in here about exactly like who they are and fine tuning and then medicalizing that. But if we're talking about giving young people agency to kind of be the driving force behind this, because these ideas have been whittled down to really sexy maxims and sound bites on social media and been disseminated, you know, faster than any. I mean, in the past, the church, you know, had pamphlets that they printed out, and as people became more literary, they would become more familiar with dogma. This dogma is really disseminated so quickly and so rapidly, faster than any church in religious history. And so, what's that?
It's mimetic. It's
Exactly.
it's
And
repeated.
so,
It's just little pieces that are repeated and endorsed without understanding any context.
and then sadly, you know, again with the right versus left thing, we have people like Chris Rufo who are really doing a lot to like uncover what's going on in schools and being taught in schools. But look at Chris Rufo's, you know, reputation, as, you know, so when it's people like that who are the really uncovering what's happening in schools and having that hardline view, it's so easy to come down on the opposite side because, oh, you know, Chris Rufo is a bad guy, you know?
Well, with 5 minutes left of this conversation, I want to just tie it to the conversation that we had before. In it's saying that we have a couple of times in this conversation used the terminology trans kids, and every time I hear that terminology, I remember how we started the conversation last time and the eye-opening kind of conversation that we had, to the point where I had to actually listen to our entire conversation again before I realized what I had been hearing in the conversation. I was so blind to the concept that even using the terminology trans kids is an acceptance of an identity as if it's a real thing, rather than something that becomes created by virtue of the way that we treat it. And so that's what I learned from Corinna at the beginning of the conversation before, and from you, Buck, too, that and interestingly, that conversation we held on the day that that study came out, basically determining, without actually without the study being written as if it illustrated this. The study actually illustrated that social transition for children under 12 is a treatment path that is likely to lead to medicalization, and at least within a certain period of time, a very low likelihood of detransition while still children, right? That path becomes sort of solidified. We don't know what happens later, but unlike previous studies, which had not socially transitioned children, and we saw a very high level of desistance, you see a low level of desistance when you do socially transition children. You see a low level of childhood desistance. So what I learned from that conversation was that conceiving of children as trans is what is likely to create their identity as trans. And that if we conceive of, as Buck, you said, children are children, if we conceive of them as children and help them, as you said, Joe, in that conversation, you know, explore what, then Stella too, explore the issues that are underlying the expression of their gender, then we can identify at some point whether these children are in the category of Buck, where, you know, their gender dysphoria is so severe that there is no treatment that will solve that problem other than transition, or if they're in the vast majority of those children who don't need that treatment in order for their gender dysphoria to be resolved. And in some cases, these children don't have gender dysphoria and are therefore, you know, being considered trans in a way that's, you know, probably going to be very detrimental to their, you know, to their future because of the likelihood of medicalization and sterilization when they don't even have a true gender dysphoria that needs to be treated with transition of any kind. So with 1 minute left, and I know, Buck, you need to leave, why don't you give us your last kind of comments first, and then you can just drop off whenever you need to, and I'll just go around and have everybody give a final comment.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess my last comments are that we just need to treat kids as kids. I say it all the time. I hate that trans kids, because everything you said is straight up. When you start to label somebody, they take on that label, and then that's what they think they are. You can literally see it with the kids. But when you start to just let a kid just do his thing, I have kids here who are like, oh, I'm non-binary. I'm like, what does that even mean? They're like, totally like, and then the next day they're not non-binary anymore. So I'm around it. I see it. You just got to let kids. You can't, what we're doing is destructive beyond belief. So I just want to again thank everyone for having these conversations. They mean a lot to me, and I think that we can grow as a community and really get the truth out to the world. So thank you all for being here, and I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Buck.
Thank you, Buck.
Joe, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I'll just second what Buck said. Working as a clinician with both gender confused kids, gender dysphoria is about a billion different things. So it's not this one thing that we all know what it is. So, I think avoiding a focus on gender dysphoria and just exploring with kids what they're going through, is a way to unlock that trans identity. I won't use that word with them, and I don't really explore gender dysphoria with them. I talk about what it feels like to be the age they are, terrified about becoming grown-ups and how they make the transition to autonomy. They're terrified and confused, and they think they can consolidate all that by just having this identity, and that resolves everything. So that's my word on that.
Thank you, Joe. Ben, why don't you go next?
I just want to say too, like I look around me, and when I live in New York, and when I see people who are very gender nonconforming and of a certain age, I'm torn between wanting to celebrate it and then also fearing like, well, I in terms of non-binary identity, it's like, in a way, if that unlocks the ability for people in that identity to feel suddenly like they have the power to kind of transgress the boundaries of rigid gender conformity, then I guess that's a good thing. But at the same time, I really, 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 really wish that we didn't have to make the sexes of male and female so much smaller in the categories of male and female. I mean, that is really what it does. It is a regressive ideology. As much as it might free up the people who practice that, it is a regressive ideology in that it doesn't expand the notion of what's possible for men and women. It actually very much limits it to identify out of your sex just because you want to be able to transgress those boundaries. So there's stuff behind it that I am like, okay, growing up as a gay kid, extremely gender nonconforming, being tormented and bullied, and really kind of defeminizing myself as a survival tactic. I thought as an activist that we were going to get to a place where categories of man and woman were going to be expanded, that that's where we were actually heading by creating more acceptance. And I was not prepared for it to double back and to kind of revert into an opposite direction. It's been a big adjustment.
Corinna.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of the adults that are standing by and watching this happen and not say anything, or if they do say anything, they feel very pressured to affirm. I think that we're in a particular social moment right now where the people are afraid to take criticism for having firm views about things. And so to the extent that people do not want to be called transphobic or homophobic, they're just willing to say what they hear other people say. In this particular case, as it concerns the transitioning of young people, those who really depend on adults for guidance and for the establishment of boundaries, when these adults are saying, well, it's not for me to judge, I really think that this is something that we should defer to the experts. I don't want to have an opinion on it. I think that collectively we need to start encouraging other adults to be able to withstand criticism for taking a stand on this issue. And I just don't know. There are so many times even people on our side say, well, I really don't blame so-and-so for buckling to this because his job is on the line or her friends won't put up with it. I think that we need to start stealing those people and telling them, hey, you're an adult. You need to be able to take some criticism by taking a stand on this.
Yeah, all of this also makes me think about how risk averse we've all become. We're so unwilling to take the risk of a reputational hit or being called names or losing your job is a big risk, but we're not willing to really put things on the line, and instead we'll just let kids be sterilized, let kids suffer. But on the other hand, lots of people are standing up to do this, to like Lisa and like all of you, being willing to take that risk. And on the other side, people are willing to do whatever they need to do because they think that what it is positive, that giving kids the opportunity to have these surgeries and be medicalized into another gender is necessary, is going to solve their suffering. So, the key I think is the conversation to see where we can at least start with, recognizing that the people that we are opposing are, as Lisa does very, very well in what she writes, the people who we're opposing are, for the most part, as concerned about the children we're concerned about as we are. Lior, let's go to you and then we'll end with Lisa.
Sure. I think I agree, Corinna, with your basic intuition here, which is that this is an issue on which the majority of Americans, I think, are at very minimum skeptical, if not outright hostile to the idea of transitioning young kids. And we just need to find a way to help them gain their moral courage in the face of real penalties. We can't deny that. But look, I sometimes get the question, is there such a thing as a trans kid? To go back to your question, Pamela. If I wanted to be perfectly honest, here's what I would say. I would say it does seem to be the case that there's a very tiny minority of people who experience throughout their lives severe suffering because of being in their body, and for whom living as the opposite sex alleviates at least some of that suffering and makes life tolerable. I think it would be foolish of us to deny that those people exist. the big problem, and it's, I think, a practical problem, is can we pick out from among young people who are by definition still in the process of figuring out who they are, can we pick out the truly trans from the merely apparently trans? And here is where I would say we need to be able to say, yes, trans kids exist. No, we have no way of knowing who they are. And for that reason, given the fact that trying to figure out who they are and transitioning them is going to do a lot more harm than good, we need to just be okay with the fact that there are going to be some kids who grow up to be trans and who would have been benefited by pediatric transition, but we're not going to give it to them because we just don't have reliable tools to figure out who is a good candidate and who isn't. I think that is a very difficult argument to make in the public. It's a lot easier to fall on one extreme or the other and say trans kids exist or trans kids don't exist. But if you wanted my honest opinion, that's what it is.
So, but one thing I would push back on a little, Lior, is to say that when you say trans kids exist, you are putting the treatment before the diagnosis, right? And so I think the more accurate way to put it is that kids with true and lifelong gender dysphoria, the kind of gender dysphoria that is not resolved without transition, exist.
Yes, I think that's right, and it's helpful. But from a practical perspective, these kids are most likely going to grow up and become trans.
Yes, but they aren't as children.
Right. You're right. You're absolutely right, and that might be a better way to put it. In other words, people with gender dysphoria exist.
Yes,
we have no ability to detect who they are, and I don't think we ever will for that matter.
And so that's why what I learned from the other conversation, because what you just said is a little bit like how I started the conversation that we had last time, which is like the real thing is to find out who the real trans kids are, right? And if we can find out who the real trans kids are and treat them as kids. And anyway, the sort of evolution that I had was to recognize that I was using the terminology of the treatment instead of the terminology of the diagnosis. And to use the diagnostic terminology is clarifying, I think, for everybody. So I now avoid using the terminology trans kids because that brings to mind, I mean, it's kind of a paradigm that you enter when you say trans kids. Whereas if you say there are kids with true gender dysphoria, true and very challenging, very difficult, and the kind of gender dysphoria that causes tremendous suffering, and that there's only one treatment for a very, very small proportion of people who have gender dysphoria in childhood. Whereas there are also people who have true gender dysphoria in childhood who will desist. And those kids with such stubborn gender dysphoria who actually do desist will be trans kids if we call them that. Right. Anyway, Lisa.
Well, picking up on what Corinna said about needing adults to stand up, I've been very focused on needing journalists to do a better job. And I really thought, maybe, I'm not sure when my awakening happened, but it must have been I knew all along that in the last 5 years of reporting that I was ignoring things, but it really wasn't until I learned about the desistance literature that I realized, well, we're not telling the full complicated story. And when I decided, okay, I'm willing to do it, despite the cost that Lior talked about, and Corinna, and I have paid those costs because I currently, it is. I lost most of my regular clients that I've been writing for many years. So, but I decided I would go ahead and I just kind of assumed that people in my profession writing for the left and mainstream press didn't understand it. I can't believe how many times I've thought this in my life, but anyway, and all I had to do was explain it to them, and then we'd arrive at enlightenment, or at least the ability to have some kind of shared reality or shared evidence base from which to discuss and debate. And then it turned out, no, it wasn't about my willingness to tell the truth. It was about the press's unwillingness to let anybody tell the truth or poke in these places. And so I've really tried to focus my argument on the left is poorly informed. And not that I have the answer, not that I can tell you what terminology we should use or how high quality or low quality the desistance literature is, or what's exactly whether or not the Dutch study holds up, but rather here are the questions we should be asking about this. And the only conclusion that I came to after all of this was we have shitty evidence and we have shitty research. And when you look at the countries that took us, just said, like, hold on a minute, this is a runaway train, we've got to pull back, we've got to figure out what to do, they're really focusing on gathering data. And there's a resistance in this country to gathering data unless it's in service of promoting your ideology already. We're going to do it, we're going to use a methodology that has a foregone conclusion. I find it similar to the kind of gun lobbies of like preventing you. Let's actually find out. We could find out that there are only 100 detransitioners and they're all in Lisa Littman's study. And that's it, you know. We could find that out, but let's find out. My suspicions could all be wrong. I'm trying to approach this with intellectual humility. I could be wrong, but I would like to see journalists push back much harder. And it means pushing back on the idea of a trans kid. It means pushing back on the idea of gender identity. They're not prepared to do that because they've accepted these ideas as truths. And it means scrutinizing the evidence and just demanding that we don't have this ability to act like Sweden or Finland or even France, which, as far as I know, just kind of issued one National Academy of Medicine issued a policy statement. I don't know what it means long term, but we're seeing resistance on these medical associations, and I just want to see us gather evidence. That's my main request, and then we can figure out what to do, because I'm not living in a shared reality with people in my political party or my fellow left-wing liberal writers. And until we have some kind of evidence base from which to make decisions, that we can't live in that shared reality.
Well said.
I ask.
Very, very well said. And you're making me remember the question that I always get when I mention these things, which is, well, what's the problem? What's the big deal? Like, so what if we let people go by other, if we let kids choose their pronouns and change their names and, all kinds of things. Who does it really hurt? What's that? Because people don't really recognize the trajectory that you set a child on, the path that they have been set on when you socially transition them, as opposed to, doing what seems to be the less kind, the less empathetic, the less compassionate thing in the moment. Well, anyway, thank you all very, very much. And Ben, thanks for coming back on with your cell phone when your computer died.
I love that.
I know we'll do more of these. I think it's really important to continue to have these conversations. And every time I post something like this, and especially when I send people to Lisa's articles and Lior's articles and Corinna's articles and Ben, your articles, and Joe, I don't know where you're writing, if you're writing things, but
I'm going to be writing for GenSpect shortly.
Okay, excellent. So we'll send people in your direction too. People always thank me for information that they didn't know about. So I know that these conversations are important. Anyway, thank you very much, and we will.
Thank you, Pamela.
Ready.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Pamela. Bye.